Welcome, everybody. We are the last thing standing in between you and lunch. So we promise to keep you awake, keep you thinking with this excellent group of people. We've been talking a lot about this issue, and I know a lot of women and a lot of men, you have sat through this discussion many times before, and things yet do not change. I don't know if we will change the world in the next 40 minutes, but we do want to have a discussion that is a little bit different than what you've heard before, and especially because we have a great perspective of everybody from, a CEO running a giant company to founders to VCs. So this is a discussion where we want to approach this topic from every angle. So let's just jump right in. The first is kind of a jump ball. We have been talking about this issue for years. Obviously, all of the events of the last 18 months have really pushed this to the fore. Are we in a moment of lasting change? Is this the time when things finally move forward?
There have been a lot of moments of lasting change, right? So I do think, this is like a profound moment in cultural history with the attention being brought to questions around gender balance and racial balance in the workplace. But it's actually, I actually kind of think of it as one of many, that you have these moments in time when an issue rises up, people pay attention to it, and we take a leap forward. Typically, there's a little bit of a slide back after that word, but I think that there's like a huge opportunity right now in all kinds of different directions. I'll stop there for a moment because I know others have some things to start off with.
I think that intersectionality is a big generational shift, and maybe it's because I'm 32, but I really think that just younger people care more about this and care more about it in an instinctive way where they don't actually have to work towards diversity. It's just how you build things from day one. And I'm really hopeful around that.
And Albert and Gisbert, is this something that you two are hearing from employees, from founders, from partners? Are you getting more questions from the younger ranks of your employees or would-be employees or portfolio companies about, what are you doing on this issue?
Yeah, there's a large group of startup founders that just got together and basically took a pledge not to take venture capital investment from a firm that doesn't have any female partners. And I think, money talks, so that's definitely something that people will pay attention to. If they think they're going to get locked out of investment opportunities because they have not thought about this topic, that's something that gets people to pay attention. And I don't think, coming back to the question of moment, I don't think we could have seen that just a few years back.
Mm-hmm. And Gisbert, you're coming to this in a different place in Klockner, and I'd love you to talk a little bit about some of what you're doing right now.
Yeah, so first of all, Klockner is of course a very conservative company. So we are a steel company, and we have a lot of steel guys, and typically a very man-driven business.
Men of steel.
Which was okay, I would say, in the past. In the past, as long as this was more a linear business. And for a linear business, men are not too bad because men are, in my point of view, more linear than women, more straightforward. So more straightforward, whereas women, this is at least my opinion. Whereas women are more empathic, women have also more social intelligence and so on. But now we're moving from a linear business, and this is true for all businesses. So in media, this has happened, I think, 15 years ago or so, to a more network type business. And in this kind of business, women are to a certain extent better off with their capabilities. And this is a reason, or one reason, why we started to promote women, even in our men's world, already starting a couple of years ago. And but we also started with a simple logic, and the simple logic for me is that women are to a certain extent different than men. And when men have capabilities, management capabilities from here to here, and women from here to here, then I'm better off if I have both. And this is also how I try to explain this to my steel people. No? So I should not make it too complicated, and this is where we started. But I think especially now with the transformation into this, even in our business, into a more network type business and so on, we are better off to have more women on board.
To what extent is the conversation around, closing this leadership gap, getting more women into the C-suite, where does it begin with building diverse teams? I mean, it's great to promote women into management roles, and obviously, this needs to be happening, but what about team structure? June or Danielle, I'd love for you guys to jump in and talk about what you've learned about team structure.
Sure. Well, I really agreed with something Danielle said earlier when you said that there's a new generation of companies that are being shaped to be diverse from the ground up. That's certainly true of the company I run with my co-founder, Darren. I believe it's true of yours as well, Daniela. And what I believe is actually not as far away from what you just said as most people here will probably think. I actually do believe that the best teams in any industry, including industries that are thought to be male, are 50-50 balanced men and women. So there's a lot of conversation right now sort of adding more women, adding a percentage of women, or even having sort of completely female-run companies. Me personally, I believe really passionately in the power of 50-50 gender-balanced teams on teams, in companies, on boards, in investors, on conference panels, in media. And the reason is that there are differences. Like human communities are balanced, 50-50 more or less. And I am taking, as we talked about the other day, a slightly old-fashioned view. I'm not taking into account into the 50% the notion of a gender spectrum. But set that aside with me for a moment, and when you think about it, there's just a natural balance I have observed that you get on a team that's all women or all men. So I actually would never want to work in a company that is all women. I wouldn't want to work on a team that's all women. I wouldn't want a board that was all women. I definitely wouldn't want any of those things that are all men. But when you have the balance, you have a natural balance that happens, and it's a balance in risk analysis, it's a balance in sitting forward and sitting back, it's a balance in listening and speaking, and it goes in all kinds of different directions. So for me, that is always the most important. And I'll just add one more little story that actually Martin and I were talking about the other night. So when my co-founder Darren and I went out to start our company, we decided this is how we're going to run it from the ground up. We're always going to be 50-50 gender balance with a great diversity across other matrices, ethnicity and sexuality, and on from there. And but we actually decided that if we were going to have a balanced board, that has to start with the first investors. You can't do it later on. And so beginning with our angel round, we just decided we are going to have half women investors. And we were actually told by most people that we were bananas. We were like, well, that's a nice idea, but like, take the money where you find it, kid. What we found, though, is that we just decided we were actually not going to talk to any male investors until we had found 50% of the money from women, because we knew that it would be harder to find women, and there's a whole set of other things that might happen. And we really stuck to that. So we were actually joking the other night, Martin and I, because Berta is one of our angel investors, that literally when we sat down to talk, because Steffi had introduced us, we literally said to him, they were like, I think you might have said we're interested. And we were like, we actually can't take your money yet because we haven't found all the women that we want, but we'll come back to you, which is a sort of absurd thing to say when you're fundraising, but it starts from there, and it just starts from deciding. And Danielle, you probably have some similar experiences in just deciding how you want to build your company.
Yeah, I mean, I feel we built a really diverse team without trying, but I think part of that is probably that I am from Brazil and Guatemala and, am a woman, and it's just, I didn't really have to think about it. But I think just one point that I wanted to make around 50-50 is I think sometimes, focusing on 50-50 actually just leads to, helping white women. And when you look at the data, biases are additive. And so Asian women are least likely to be promoted. Black women make less than everyone else. And so I just think, we need to make sure that, we have a more diverse looking panel when we just discuss these things too moving forward. Yeah.
Amen to that. And really quickly, I just want, for our audience who's had so much brain food, you want actual food, so we're trying to keep you awake. How many of you work on gender balanced teams here? I got one, I got two, okay. Not a lot. And, how many of you are in a position where you can determine the makeup of teams and you are in hiring roles? Where are the bosses? All right. So you have homework after this. It's going to gender balanced teams. So, one of the other things that I think, we want to talk about in not only building gender balanced teams, but the conversations around leadership and who should be in charge. I mean, we were talking earlier about, this isn't necessarily men's fault. It would be very easy to say that, but it's not. And part of it is the expectations that we place on men and the careers that they have to have and the milestones that they have to hit. Are there better ways of talking about and thinking about careers and what progression in career paths should look like? I mean, I think career pathing is something that companies are really deficient in. And, Albert, I'm curious, overseeing a lot of portfolio companies and talking about people's growth ambitions, what do you see?
Well, one of the things we've been doing recently is encouraging companies to hire ahead of people much earlier than we used to. I mean, it used to be the case that we would wait until companies would have, 100 or even 200 employees. And now we're often like, hey, you have 30 employees. You might want to think about getting ahead of people, because if you don't have somebody in the company who sort of thinks about these issues all day, every day as kind of the primary thing that they do, it's very easy for everybody else, whatever background they have, it's very easy for this not to be one of their top 5 things. Like, very, very easy. And so, how do we make progress how do you make progress on anything in a company is you have somebody whose job it is to make progress on that.
What is the reaction among the founders that you talk to when you say that? They argue?
Well, I think people are receptive to the idea that they want to build the best possible teams, and that having a head of people will help them build the best possible teams. And so I think if you approach it from that angle, people are very open to it. I think if you were to start on the opposite end and just say, you need a head of people so you get gender balance, I don't think you would get very far in the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think HR has evolved from being a regulatory or compliance or watching out for things that they're not working to being actually a key partner in growing a company. I mean, we just hired our head of people. We're about 35 employees right now in New York City, and I see that this person, when she starts in a few weeks, is going to be a really key partner in actually growing the business, because in the end, the people in your company who you bring in and how they work with each other is the end-all be-all, no matter the technology or whatever else you're doing.
And Gisbert, can you talk a little bit about, as you are implementing this system to get more women in management, your goals are 20% by 2020, and I assume 50-50 is not far beyond that, but obviously, it's steps. How has the reaction been among the men in the company? How are you explaining this to them?
First of all, it has, in such a company like Klöckner, it has to be clearly driven from the top. Otherwise, it doesn't work anyhow. And you have to explain this to men, because men, at least in our industry, like to hire men. No? They like to hire more of themselves. And even in the supervisory board, they like to hire men. For instance, we have one example. When we had the first woman in the supervisory board, this woman was only saying something when she really had to say something, whereas the men were more or less talking all the time. And after a few weeks, the head of the supervisory board came to me saying and was saying, look, we might have chosen the wrong candidate because she is not saying enough. And then I said to him, look, have you ever heard what she is saying, and have you ever heard what your other guys are saying as a supervisory board? And then things started to change somewhat. But also, and that was for me extremely important, to make sure that women keep the difference they have, because what I've also often seen, that women had to change themselves to a certain extent if they wanted to make career in a man's world. But when they do this, then I'm losing this advantage of having a broader management capability. So, and all this has to be driven by the top. And what I'm doing is that I'm explaining this to my people all the time. So we have a hierarchy-free communication system. I'm always teaching also my management team how to do it going forward. But it's a lot of, especially in such a conservative world, there's a lot of communication necessary. We are so far very successful on the C level in functional areas. We still have difficulties on the operational side. So because they are selling steel and so on, this is still typically more men's world, but we're making progress there as well. But it takes some time.
And in addition to, setting the tone, what are the other things that, what are the other roles that men can play? I mean, in some of this, I think you bring up a really good point, which is you look at a lot of companies that do have women in leadership, and, this is obviously no offense because these are very important roles, but they're doing HR, they're doing finance, they're doing marketing, which is a great start. But, what you don't see enough of, in my view, and what I've observed is companies there seems to be a reluctance on the part of companies to put women in roles that I would call bet the company roles in big corporations. And so, I think that real victory is sort of, you see a woman as head of product at a big tech company or something like that, where the company will succeed or fail based on a woman. And I think obviously with women founders, this is the case, but in big corporations, we don't see enough of this. And, this is, again, a jump ball for anyone who wants to answer it. But what has to change there? What are the material things that, Albert, I know you've worked in large companies and worked with big tech companies. What has to happen to convince people to change?
Well, I think Gisbert made a good point about supervisory boards. I mean, I'm on a lot of supervisory boards, and they are predominantly male, and they represent the predominantly male investor group, and our firm, we were part of this. I mean, we, until recently, were 5 guys until we added our first woman partner. And so, that's true for a lot of venture capital firms. As these firms take board seats, the boards wind up being predominantly male, and they wind up feeling, as Gisbert said, more comfortable with male candidates, especially for bet the company type roles. So I think, this change will take a long time to play itself out because venture capital funds have a 10-year lifetime, and they don't hire new partners every day. One of the groups we haven't talked about in this context is the LP community. So I mentioned that there are some founders who've taken a pledge. I think if LPs took a pledge not to back firms that didn't have women partners, I think things would change more quickly than before. But that change needs to ripple all the way through to the supervisory boards to address the question that you just asked.
But I think this is extremely important to address this, because in this transformational area in which we are, and especially when to transform this more conservative companies without women, this will not work. This will clearly absolutely not work, and we would have not made that progress in the last 4 years without women. And interestingly, when we launch new initiatives, so we typically I do it in a way that I launch new initiatives as an MVP, and then I'm asking who wants to lead this initiative, and typically all our initiatives are led by women. If it's failure nights, or if it's this hierarchy-free communication and all these things, they typically are led by women, and so this and therefore it's also extremely important for a supervisory board to support this. And so what I'm trying is trying to teach my supervisory board how to handle this going forward.
I think a couple of things. I think that number one, much of the change has to come from the top in established organizations, and it has to come from the beginning in the new startups. Because, and 2 points I'd love to make there. One is that in a new startup, culture cements very quickly. I mean, you have your first 5 people. If they are all the same, every person you add from that point on will first of all face a company that is a culture that either is or is not like them. Also, every single person in that company brings in other people. Like you said before, Daniela, you're Brazilian. You're going to naturally attract people who are of many backgrounds. Each of us is an amplifier for our own network. If you have all white people, you're going to have naturally largely white networks, and so on. You can put any provision along that. You have to catch it early. You have to enforce it early, in my opinion. Not in my opinion. That is what the data would tell you. The second thing I would say is that the way to move forward is if we have data on our side. This is what the data tells us. The data tells us that companies that have balanced boards do better. They don't just feel better or look better, they do better financially. Companies with mixed executive teams do better. And I think there's really an important point in a company like yours that bringing more women, it's not a zero-sum game. Bringing in women doesn't mean that the men lose. Particularly in things like, even like you mentioned before, this kind of a scenario of a room where there's a lot of guys talking and the woman takes her time. She makes the 2 points she wants to make. I bet there were some men in that room who also stayed quiet because they're introverts or because they're just not as outward. And they will actually do better, perform better, contribute better in a company that has a mixed group where there is a sort of a damper put on that tendency. So I think that when you look at the data, and if we rely on the data and not just our inclinations, it's going to support leaning toward
the other thing I'd like to say is that I think some of these other functions like marketing and HR, I think those are bet the company functions. And I think like traditionally, you know, these kinds of roles that maybe more women are in are equally important, and we should frame them as such. And I think another thing is visibility is important. I think, you know, we talked on the phone the other day that there's just a lot of women out there who are just not as self-promotional as, you know, maybe the average male CEO or founder. And very often, honestly, like every week I hear about a company that I know all about the company and I didn't know the CEO was a woman. I've never seen her on TV. I haven't seen her, you know, in the newspaper, et cetera. So I think, you know, the media can play also a role in telling, you know, more stories of more diverse leaders.
Deal. Agreed. But I think also there's a resistance. You know, I think, you know, June, you and I were talking about this too, about, you know, I think as you know, you guys having, you know, planning events and booking podcasts, you go out to women with a ton of invitations, and what happens?
Yeah. We were just talking about this backstage as well. So I do believe this is one of the hidden reasons that you don't see more women in the world. There is definitely a leadership gap, but there's also a tremendous visibility gap. So there are so many more women leaders in the world than we know because we don't see them. So Daniela and I are not that unique. There are at least hundreds, if not thousands, of women running startups. There are thousands of women on boards. There are thousands of women on executive teams. Women are actually very often the strong number 2 in a company where there's a male CEO. Sheryl Sandberg is not the exception, she's the rule. But what happens here, so it's easy, the easy answer to say is like, oh, all those male curators and journalists, they don't invite women to their panels. That can be partially true, but that actually isn't the answer. The answer is that women say no. So I was, for 11 years, the executive producer at TED. I'll tell you one story. There was a small event I ran. I invited 7 men and 7 women. 6 men said yes, 6 women said no. And that happens almost every time. Women say no, they're more likely to say no, and they are way more likely to cancel. And some of the typical reasons you might think for that, you might be like, oh, women have families and they have that responsibility, or they're less confident. Those are not the reasons, actually. I believe the reasons are that women have a different set of values when it comes to leadership. We tend to want to be in the office doing our work. We want to be with our teams. We want to be doing the work. We think that's the most important thing, and it's important. Men place some more value on being out in the world and telling the story, and actually they're both important. And my wish for the world is actually, and yours maybe too, is like for more women to say yes. So typically women will say yes to speaking engagements when they're guilted into it. Like you have to smoke them out. I said yes because it's Steffi, Martin, and yes. And I like to speak, but I feel like my work is in the office. And that's part of what we have to cut through, because there actually are way more women leaders than appear to be.
Yeah, they have to ask more aggressive, I would say, also for promotions. So this is also what I'm experiencing, that men are much more aggressive when there is a position, a new
Step
position.
Forward.
Yeah, and the woman is waiting and wants to be called, but they have to be more.
At the same time, I think there's a responsibility on the part of people in charge, whether that's men or women, urging women to raise their hands for promotions, because I think, obviously this study has been cited a million times, but if a woman looks at a job description that has 10 bullet points and she meets like 9 of them, she's not going to apply. And a guy looks at it and there's 3 and he's like, all right, So I think there's also, even last night at dinner, talking to people here about, people who have had great bosses, male and female, who've tapped them on the shoulder and said, you should think about this job. And whether they say yes or no to the promotion, it's, it depends on people's circumstances, but I think there is, when we talk about the role of men and just the role of bosses, period, is getting people to start thinking about what their career can be. Albert, I'm curious as, where you see this when you look at teams that are forming and people who think they're ready to step up? You know, how do you manage that chemistry?
Well, I want to come back to this idea of companies early on investing and having a head of people, because I do think a lot of this is a function of processes and how you design your processes. You know, so for instance, when we at UN Square Ventures recruit new analysts, we make it a completely open process. Anybody can apply, and that does result in a fairly imbalanced applicant pool. We have probably 5x as many male applicants. But then in our first screening, we use sort of fairly open criteria that aren't necessarily geared towards one type of person doing better than another. And when we get down further in the funnel, it evens out pretty quickly. So I think it really has a lot to do with process design. So for instance, one of the things that a lot of our companies really struggle with is trying to get any kind of semblance, never mind balance, but like any kind of representation of women on the engineering teams. And what a lot of people have found is that they really need to change the interview process pretty drastically to get results in that. And so I think a lot of this really comes down to designing processes that are less reinforcing of existing bias and more open to, you know, a broad set of talent that's out there.
Mm-hmm. And Albert, I have a question for you too, and just Barrett, I'll get to you with this one too, but you know, as you mentioned, June, you know, we were talking about all of the data about women in leadership, and there are like so many very bleak statistics that we can cite, but there is also an equally robust amount of data about that gender balanced teams, you know, do return better results. And so like having all of this empirical data, which is the currency of tech, can you give me the VC's eye view of, you know, why aren't firms investing then in more women-led startups and more diverse startups with diverse teams?
Because venture capital isn't driven by average returns, it's driven by outsized returns. And so, you know, I think this is one of those situations where, you know, looking at the data is not really what we do on any investment, basically. So, you know, you'd think that venture capital might be data-driven, but it's a lot of seat of the pants by the, you know, it's a lot of, oh, we think this is going to be good. I mean, often we invest when it's like, you know, 4 people and not even a product, and sometimes we invest when it is a product, but it's still very early. Sometimes we invest when a lot is happening, but like, even then, you know, the amount of data relative to where you think the company is ultimately going to go is only going to take you so far. So I do think people bring a lot of intuition to it rather than data. And when you bring intuition to it, you will look at, you know, the Zuckerbergs and the Jobs and the Musks of the world. And so that will need to change at some point for people not to apply this intuition. I think it's easy to talk about data, and the data is compelling. It's just that it's much, much easier to make decisions not based on data.
And when you come to running a big company, even a public company, the data does matter, right? It does matter when you have a fiduciary duty to your shareholders. Why aren't more CEOs pushing for this then? I mean, if the data is clear that their performance could improve, why aren't more CEOs pushing for this? And why aren't more boards and investors pushing for this?
Yeah, it's a good question. But when you, to be honest, when you look to our supervisory board, they wouldn't also have pushed it in the past, and this may be still the case, that it's that this is really more still to a certain extent more an old boys network. So this is also still there, yeah.
That corporate decision making isn't any more rational than venture capital decision making.
Yeah.
It's also difficult
Thanks for bursting my bubble.
It's also difficult to retrofit any structure for diversity and inclusion, again, if it wasn't built that way from the ground up. So, you know, I was speaking to Ellen Pao, who some of you may know, wrote a book about diversity and inclusion in Silicon Valley. And, you know, the way she put it to me, she's like, we don't have a brand name company like, say, a Facebook that is actually built on diversity and inclusion, right? There's all these companies that are now, you know, either due to social external pressure or because they just know it's the right thing to do to help their company grow, to focus on these kinds of things. But we need to start seeing companies like that, you know, built from the ground up with these, you know, just mission and vision in place.
But on the other hand, I also think that this is already a movement,
yeah.
So that it's changing. it probably takes some time. And so, for instance, you were saying that there are so many women available also for leadership positions. Sometimes it's not that easy, I have to say, especially when you are in a business like us. So there might be more attractive businesses for women than steel, for instance. And so what we did, with our headhunting companies where we're working with, we forced them to get more access to women, but it's a process. But even when I'm looking to business schools, for instance, in a lot of business schools, there women are still underrepresented, and sometimes only 1/3 are women. And also this makes it not easier. What we also have to do, we have to change working hours, or the freedom also to work at home. This is also what we're doing. So in our company, the people can decide where they want to work, and even when women getting a child, they can keep in their leadership position and also do it from home. They only have to manage in a certain way, but they can decide how to do it. And
by the way, I bet that helps the fathers team as well.
But for some in a certain period when the baby comes, the woman is more engaged, obviously. But even then you have to make sure that they have the freedom to do what they want to do. And so it's a process which will probably take. And when you take the largest 30 German companies, the DAX companies, there's only one female head of a supervisory board, so 29 are still men, and so it might take some time, but it's
a lot of work to do.
And I think that even in industries and companies that have perhaps less of the odds stacked against them, it's always harder. You mentioned this before, Danielle. It's always harder to change an organization that's in place, and it's actually I actually think almost always going to be harder to find women, again, because there is a less of a tendency to reach out for the opportunities. I actually really believe, and this is a controversial position to some, I really believe in setting a proportion. That's why it's sort of on our team internally, we have decided we are going to be 50-50 gender balance, as well as we have very extensive ethnic diversity as well. It's just easier to put a percentage on the gender, and we stick to that. And we know that the truth is, for us, it has not been harder to find women or men, but we know that we have to stick to it. I'll give you an example too. On our in my new company, Wait What, we have a podcast called Masters of Scale. It's hosted by Reid Hoffman. It features founders like Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg. And we decided from day one that we were going to be 50-50 gender balance. We're actually the only American media property that has committed to being 50-50 gender balanced. And the reason that we decided that up front is because we knew that the program would naturally completely fill with men in a second if we didn't. Because you can think of the men more quickly, they say yes more quickly. In the year since he's been hosting it, Reid has had easily hundreds of men in his network reach out to him who want to be on the show. He has had 0 women reach out to him who want to be on the show. It's just not the behavior we see. So, and we've had many more of the women say no. So they say no and they cancel. But there is no lack of women. We have a list 100 long of women we'd love to have the show who are as accomplished as the men. But if you don't decide, it'll slide. And I think it's really the same in hiring as well, that by putting a hard percent in place and just saying, as hard as it is, we're not going to hire, we're not going to go lower than this percentage. We are going to keep searching until we find the amazing woman out there to fill the role.
And I think the other part of this that we talked about too is that often when women are given that visibility, and this is really meta right now, but they're also called to talk about their experience as women and not necessarily their business. I mean, we were joking about this, like, I frankly would love to talk to you about your startup, which has nothing to do with women. I mean, it's about communications. When, GoTenna is all about keeping the communications network going, even when things go down. And, I am going to guess that you get a lot more invitations to speak about doing business while female than just about doing business.
Definitely.
So call this woman for your actual business needs.
Daniela said we need examples. Slack is potentially the most promising example. and I really hope they do well. Chief Product Officer is April Underwood, and they have a very diverse engineering team. They've invested in this for a long period of time, and I think they've done a phenomenal job. I think there was an article that came out just a day or two ago talking about the story of how Slack has built their diverse team, and I would encourage everybody to read that.
Can I just share something? So we had Stuart Butterfield, the founder of Slack, on Masters of Scale, and I don't know April personally, but I know her by her work. And so I was like, let's have her as a secondary interview on this so the world can see that Slack's product is really driven by a woman. And she turned me down. It happens every day.
Paging April.
Paging April. But that happens, but we just have to keep pushing through that. But it is a great example that I wish more people knew about.
Everyone here, put this out to your networks.
So by the way, so what can also, I'm in principle, I'm not for quotas, but in this case that might also help, at least for a certain time, to accelerate women in management, to have a quota, a fixed quota, what you have for some time, and this okay, we have in Germany for certain companies we have this quotas, but companies don't necessarily have to fulfill them. They have to explain where they don't fulfill. But this could also be a measure which helps.
Mm-hmm. Really quickly, we have just a couple of minutes left. I wanted to give, I enjoy having access to you guys all myself, but I wanted to give the audience a time for some questions. Yes, and please identify yourself. And
Hi, I'm Janice Lentz from Hearing Access and Innovations. We regularly talk about diversity in terms of gender or race, but we haven't mentioned disability diversity. And that, the D in diversity stands for disability, and even this conference, which is fantastic, does not have one panel about disabilities and doesn't have hearing accessibility. How do we bring that into the conversation so it's not about charity, but the same thing? If you're not in the room, you can't even be on the board, let alone in the office.
That's a great point.
I mean, yeah, I've mentioned this in different ways, but I just think intersectionality, every single kind of, minority group, so to speak, the biases are additive. So if you have a disability and you're also of color or a woman or, in some other underrepresented category, they're all really important. And that's part of why I think that the diversity and inclusion narrative is kind of owned by gender, but it's so much deeper than that. It goes also to, hiring people who have different educational backgrounds, come from different places, speak different languages, come from different socioeconomic backgrounds, because otherwise you could very well have like a United Colors of Benetton team, but everyone went to the same 5 schools, right, and like have the same ability or lack of disability as well. So I completely agree with you.
Two quick thoughts back. I feel that actually one of the strongest ways that I've liked to talk about disability internally is that it's the same as what I mentioned before, that usually everything you do to help team members with disabilities help everyone. So if you have a ramp, it helps everybody if they hurt themselves, if they have a suitcase with them, if they're carrying a kid, if you have, if you design your website for people who are hearing impaired, it actually is just easier to navigate for everyone. All of these changes are actually lift all boats, and so it's just as a response, that's how I've liked to talk about it in the business world, is that this actually helps everyone. It's not about charity.
Let's get another question in.
Actually,
yes.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yes. Oh, great. You've got the mic.
I'll pass it over to you. But I think one of the things I was curious about, first of all, I'm Diane Brady, journalist, and I 100% agree. Women have been terrible sources, by and large, for us, and they always say no on panels. So I think outcome-driven is very powerful, but I'd also just... I'd like to talk a little bit about tactics as well, because I'll give you just 2 quick anecdotes. One is a lot of women say no, but when I was doing some videos recently, a CEO reached for a book and held it up like Vanna White, and I thought, did nobody ever tell you you're too important to do? Like, it kind of looked like not the sort of thing a CEO should do. Like she was very, it was like this Faustian pact I think women have, is when they are covered, we cover their fertility and footwear and stuff, so they say no for very valid reasons. So what are your tactics beyond putting pressure on boards, putting pressure on, journalists to get women? What are some of the tactics to actually get people to say yes, all of you? Yes to the opportunity, yes to the interview.
Yeah, for me, my company is I'm teaching my people on my management teams why we need this, especially in this phase of a digital transformation where we are in. And this then on a constant basis, ever and ever again, and this, I would say, and also the success the women have who lead our initiatives. Also, this helps. Also, here men are seeing how this works and how we're making progress with this. And so that's it's not one measure, I would say. There are a couple of measures and a couple of issues which you constantly have to drive forward.
And I think it's leadership by example. I mean, we've added a woman partner, we've backed women entrepreneurs, we have our CEO summit coming up, we have women speakers. I mean, it's just generating more and more examples that you can point to. I think it's critical.
Yeah. I'll share a couple of thoughts. I think in terms of leadership, one of the things I've always done with all the women on my team, men as well, is getting them to speak publicly. So I think a lot about speaking publicly in media positioning, and it's about practice like anything else. And so in weekly team meetings, always have people presenting until it becomes second nature to them. For reaching out to women executives to speak or to do op-eds or to do media appearances, a couple of things. One is I guilt them, and I play the woman card. I kind of inform them that all women say no, and therefore they should say yes. And actually, that is very effective because we don't realize that we're doing it. Like I said, I turn down things all the time. I'm one of those women. It's ridiculous. The second thing is I try to create a little bit of safety. Women are actually it is rational. Women declining because women are we saw this in the comments on TED.com. We see it. Women are criticized more. They are analyzed more. And if you forget it, if your clothes don't look good on you, you are criticized. So all of these things actually matter. They're not made up in the minds of women. They actually do. And so it's things like even in Masters of Scale 1, setting up an environment where if they say something that they don't want to share, we don't include it. So we're not trying to catch them in something. We just want to share their ideas. We emphasize that we want to talk about their work. We don't want to talk to them about being a woman. Actually, when we prepared the dossier for Sheryl Sandberg, we literally could not find one article anywhere that talked about what she actually did. She's so covered, but it's like a walking commencement speech. It's just like inspiration for other people. And then, along with that, offer multiple dates. If something doesn't work, we can do it again. Make it easy for them. With Masters of Scale, the fortunate part is that it's audio, which makes it a little easier if you don't have to worry about what you look like. And again, it's not vanity; it's practicality. It is actually what happens when if you look at the comments. TED is just a metric for me. Nobody talks about what the men wear or what they look like, but they do talk about women. They have to be prepared. So as silly as it sounds, even engaging with them of we have a makeup artist for you, we'll have a hairstylist for you, and that actually gets past a barrier for a lot of women. Or you don't have to worry about what you look like, we're just going to record the audio. And then on top of that, leaning into what matters to them, right? Every entrepreneur, man and woman, we have things we really care about and we want to amplify. And I find just leaning into that sort of why it matters, whether it's a role or whether it's a media appearance, why it matters. You can tell I've thought about this a lot.
That was a lot of very useful advice right there.
And I'll just say very briefly, maybe don't always think of contacting a female source just to talk about what it's like to be a woman, because we do a lot of other things, have a lot of other thoughts, So
excellent. Well, Daniela, Albert, June, Gisbert, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks.